So this webinar is part of the Oregon Master Gardeners Advanced Training Series, but we have a lot of guests today that are joining us from all over the country, so welcome. This is a wonderful topic on food safety in gardens, and it's going to touch all of our work out in the communities. And so I am really pleased to welcome Sara Runkel. I have a little bio to read here. So Sara Runkel is the Extension horticulturist for Josephine County in Oregon. She develops and provides educational programming for small farms, home and community horticulture audiences, and coordinates the Josephine County Master Gardener Program. Sara is also a Produce Safety Alliance trainer and farm food safety educator. She has a Master of Science degree in Sustainable Systems from Slippery Rock University and over 15 years of farming experience. Prior to working at OSU Extension, Sara owned and operated a diversified farm in Pennsylvania where she grew vegetables for a winter CSA, specialty cut flowers, and pastured poultry. So we're really pleased and appreciative that Sara is going to share some of her experiences today. So we'll give her a moment to pull up and share her screen. And again, like Mark mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box. And there's time at the end where we'll do a moderated session where we can answer, get all those questions answered for you. And so for now, I will mute myself and let Sara take it away.
Okay, thank you, Brooke. So hopefully you can all see my screen now. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see folks from all over the country attending this webinar. So today we are going to be talking about practical food safety in the edible garden. And backyard and local food production really continues to be a popular topic. You know, we're constantly being encouraged to eat more fruits and vegetables and stay active, and growing your own food is a great way to do that. Just some statistics, some of these are a few years old, but in 2014, the National Gardening Association did a survey and they found that 35% of US households grow food at home or in a community garden. And so that equals around 44 million households in the United States. In 2012, the American Community Gardening Association, in partnership with Rutgers University, did a survey and identified over 8,500 community gardens in North America. So that included the US and Canada. And there are over 7,000 school gardens in the US, and in Oregon alone, there are 697 school gardens. So there are a lot of people growing food and eating it. So before we get started today, I just have a quick poll, and Mark's going to pull up a so I typically do food safety trainings for farmers that are growing produce, and the information that I'm going to talk about today is really useful for anybody growing food, whether you're a farmer or a home gardener or a school garden coordinator. We're going to talk about different ways to minimize risk in the garden. This is an interesting survey. So there's not a lot of data available looking at foodborne illness outbreaks traced back to home gardens or community gardens. And part of that is because of the way that foodborne illnesses are tracked. But a number of universities in the Northeast did a survey of home gardeners to get a better understanding of their food safety practices. And some of the interesting things that they found was that a lot of the gardeners, so they sent out 5,000 surveys and they had 800 returned. And most of the respondees didn't understand that contamination from bacteria could come from a variety of places, including from their home garden. They often viewed chemicals as a larger problem in their garden, not necessarily pathogens. And especially folks that grew organically, they didn't necessarily connect microbial issues with organically grown produce, which some people consider to be safer. And they also didn't consider water as a source of pathogenic bacteria. So there's a lot to learn when it comes to growing an edible garden, from pest and disease management to soil fertility and water management. And especially for beginning farmers and gardeners, food safety may not even be on the list of topics that they're concerned about. So my goal for this morning is really to help you see your garden or the garden education that you do through a food safety lens. And help you identify food safety risks in the garden. Every garden is different, and there are often multiple ways that you can reduce risk in your particular situation. So I'll give some examples about things you can do to minimize risk, but really I'm hoping you'll take away this food safety lens and be able to identify the risks and then start addressing them in your own garden or when you talk with gardeners in your community. So when we talk about risks in the garden related to food safety, there are really three different types of contamination. So physical risks, think about broken glass or stones, those sorts of things are pretty minimal. Chemicals are another risk. So we will touch a little bit on lead and heavy metals, but pesticides are also another source of chemical risk in the garden. What we're really going to focus on today, though, are the biological risks because they are the most common sources for foodborne illness. In the United States, according to the CDC, these are the statistics about foodborne illness in the United States. So this is for all types of foodborne illness, whether they come from meat and dairy, fish, produce. But you'll see on this graphic that close to 50% of foodborne illnesses in the United States are caused by microorganisms contaminating fresh produce. They're not necessarily the highest risk when it comes to deaths from foodborne illness, but they are a big source of foodborne illnesses in the US. So just a little refresher on microorganisms. Most microorganisms are harmless. Some are even beneficial. We have a lot of E. coli in our digestive tract, and most of them are not a problem, but there are a few that can cause you to be sick. Some only cause foods to spoil, and others cause disease in humans, and we refer to those as pathogens. So this is a list of some of the more common microorganisms that cause foodborne illness, as well as some of the chemical contaminants that are a food safety risk. The ones that are highlighted in orange are the ones that are most commonly associated with fresh produce. So contamination of food from microbial pathogens can only come from an external environmental source. They're often found in the intestinal tract of domestic and wild animals and humans as well. And when those, what we're really trying to do here is minimize the possibility for fecal oral contamination, which in lay terms means don't eat poop. So that's really, we can sum up this talk about pathogens in that short sentence. So what is the concern? So, as I mentioned before, most of the foodborne illness outbreaks are found on fruits and vegetables. They're caused by a variety of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Bacteria tend to be of particular concern because they can multiply outside of their host. So even when bacteria are on the surface of a berry or a leaf, if they have the right environmental conditions, they can continue to multiply. And for some pathogens, it can take as little as 1 or 10 cells to cause someone to be sick. So common symptoms are really, gastrointestinal distress, so upset stomach, diarrhea, vomiting, For most people that have a healthy immune system, these symptoms usually go away within a few days, but they, especially with people that have compromised immune systems, can cause lasting damage, hospitalization, and sometimes even death. So the top 5 microorganisms for all foodborne outbreak are this norovirus, salmonella, clostridium, campylobacter, and staph. The norovirus and salmonella, again, the ones in orange are the ones that are associated with fresh produce. And then there are some that are more likely to lead to hospitalization. I don't want to scare anyone away from eating fruits and vegetables. So most fruits and vegetables are free of pathogens. If you cook your fruits and vegetables, that kills most pathogens. So the things that we eat raw are of the highest risk of causing illness if they're contaminated. So what we're really trying to think about as we go through this presentation and apply the food safety lens to your gardening is what can you do to minimize contamination at multiple steps throughout the process? Because once the produce is contaminated, it can be very difficult to completely remove all of the pathogens. As I mentioned before, anybody can be sick, but there are some groups that are at greater risk. So the very young, the very old, people with compromised immune systems, pregnant women who are pregnant. So it's important to be aware of potential risks and establish practices that minimize the chance of contamination throughout the growing, harvesting, and preparation processes. And just some statistics from the CDC. So pregnant women are 10 times more likely to get a listeria infection, and people on dialysis are 50 times more likely to come down with listeria than someone with a healthy immune system. And children are at highest risk for salmonella infection, especially children under 5. Okay, so let's talk about gardening. Now we've talked about the things that we're concerned about. So these are the different areas that we'll go through when assessing risk in the garden. And you can see that it covers kind of all stages of the gardening process. So we'll talk about the foods that we're concerned about. We already mentioned, it's fresh fruits and vegetables, where the garden's located, what you're using to fertilize, how you're irrigating, washing produce, animals in the garden, harvest, and last but not least, gardener health and hygiene. Fresh fruits and vegetables that are eaten raw are of the most concern because there's no kill step. In particular, fruits and vegetables that have a rough surface and are difficult to wash tend to hold pathogens if they are on the surface more tightly. Produce that has the edible portion in contact with the ground is also more likely to become contaminated than, say, a stalk of corn or a tomato that's been trellised that's up off of the ground. When thinking about your garden location, think about what was on the site before you put your edible garden in. Are there any adjacent land uses? Was there, if you're in an urban area, was there a building on the site? We'll talk about this more, especially when it comes to lead and heavy metal contamination as a possible risk. If you live in the country, do you live near a farm that has animals? Is there a chance that your garden might be contaminated from runoff or wind carrying fecal material, basically, from compost or manure piles? What's the wildlife? We'll talk in more detail about wildlife and domestic animals in your area. Flooding can also be a a concern. So if your garden is near a waterway that's prone to flooding, floodwater can carry all kinds of contaminants, both pathogens as well as chemical contaminants. And if you have a septic system, you need to be aware of where that tank and the leach field are, so that you don't risk possibly contaminating your food with a leak from your septic system. So fertilizers are a potential source of pathogens. And so this slide talks about the different types of fertilizer and the risk associated with them. So commercial fertilizers, whether they're organic or chemical, have been treated to kill any pathogens, and so they're very low risk in terms of foodborne illness. Compost that is made with no manure is a slightly higher risk, just because compost can attract rodents and birds, and both of those rodents and birds can carry pathogens, particularly salmonella, and can contaminate your compost. Composted manure is the next highest risk, and if you're going to be composting your manure, you need to make sure that you follow a process that has been demonstrated to kill pathogens. So maintaining a core temperature of 131 to 170 degrees for 15 days, and turning the material 5 times. That's the standard for the USDA National Organic Program for making compost, and has been shown to effectively kill pathogens in compost as well as weed seeds. This can often be difficult to achieve on a home garden scale. So often if you're going to be using manure in compost, and even compost that you're making in your backyard that might be contaminated with rodent droppings or bird droppings, it's best to think of it as raw manure, even if it may only have a small percentage of contamination in it. So to minimize risk from fertilizers, there are a couple of things that you can do. So the one is to choose a treated fertilizer, one that doesn't have any pathogens in it. If you do use manure, you want to incorporate it into the soil. Right now, there's not a lot of research actually on that provides specific recommendations on how to use manure in food production. So they're still doing research on that, and they've actually recently found that some pathogens like salmonella can survive in the soil. They're more likely to survive in the soil if they've been incorporated than if they've been left on the surface. So there's kind of mixed messages, but there are other reasons why you probably want to incorporate the manure into your soil. The biggest thing you can do is have a good length of time between when you apply the manure and when you're harvesting the edible portion of the crop. So right now, the best recommendation that we can give is to follow the organic standards, which are 90 days before harvest for crops where the edible portion does not come into contact with the ground or fertilizer, and then 120 days if the edible portion comes into contact with the ground. I'll say this and again, but the main thing is just be aware of the potential risks. Is there a risk of cross-contamination with your tools, especially the footwear that you use? If you're doing any compost teas or foliar feeding, especially if you're using anything with untreated material, that's a great breeding ground for microorganisms. If you're doing a foliar feeding close to harvest, you want to make sure that you're using potable water, not say a surface water source, and we'll talk about water in more detail. Okay, here we go, water. So when you're growing food, you need to, for the most part, we all irrigate our gardens, and there are multiple different sources of water. So municipal water is the least risky, so it is considered drinking water and has been tested. Of course, there are instances where municipal water is contaminated, especially with heavy metals or lead. So it's nothing's 100% risk-free, but it tends to be the lowest risk. Treated groundwater is the next up in the chain of risk. And so whether it's treated with chlorine or UV, just straight groundwater tends to be pretty low risk, but the key here is to make sure you test your groundwater. So whether you're using it for irrigation or it's your drinking water, it's a good idea to have your well water tested on a regular basis. Once a year is good to make sure that it's free of any fecal coliforms. Surface water has a higher risk because there's a lot of variability in surface water, especially flowing water. You don't have any idea or control over what's happening upstream. So you can minimize risk with surface water applications by using drip irrigation, so the water is not coming into contact with the edible portion of the crop, or leaving an interval between when you do overhead irrigation and when you harvest the fruits and vegetables. The least risky thing you can do if you're irrigating is, again, to use potable water. So especially with leafy greens or strawberries, berries, where the edible portion of the plant is going to contact the water close to harvest. Just be aware of seasonal water quality, especially if you're using surface water sources. If you have a pond or a static water source, keep an eye on what's happening in that pond. I was irrigating out of a pond one summer, and we ended up with a deer that had been hit by a car dying right on the edge of the pond, and had to remove that from the water source. And that's certainly a risk for pathogen contamination. And yeah, if you do have a well, make sure that your wellhead is secure and that the ground around the wellhead slopes away, so you don't risk contamination of your well water. And if you have places where you might cross surface water or potential contaminants, like if you're foliar feeding and have a fertilizer injector, those sorts of things, having a backflow prevention device on your groundwater source is really important. So if you're using surface water, drip irrigation is a great way to minimize risk because it doesn't spray water on the edible portion of the crop. Again, try to maximize the time between watering and harvest, because it's been shown that the pathogens on the surface of the leaf die off over time from UV light. And don't use gray water when irrigating your edible plants. Keep your gray water for your ornamental plantings. Okay. Animals in the garden. And I see that there are questions coming up. We are going to take time to answer questions. We should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's talk about animals in the garden. And this is often hard, especially for home gardeners, because we love our pets, cats and dogs, and some of us have backyard poultry, and of course wildlife is a concern. And mostly when we think of wildlife in the garden, it's a concern because they're damaging the crops, not necessarily because they could be making us sick, but there is also the potential for that. So rats and mice are a form of wildlife, especially in urban and rural areas as well. But if you have a root cellar, or if you have a compost pile, You can attract rodents to where you're producing food. Salmonella is the main concern. And here's some nice images of rats and mice in compost, and why you should probably consider home small-scale compost as raw manure as opposed to a treated source of fertilizer. On that picture on the right, the bottom left, you can see that nice big rat hole in that pile of food scraps and some rodent babies. So to minimize risk from animals, it's recommended to keep domestic animals out of the edible portion of your garden. So this can be a challenge, but you should be aware, especially cats can carry a parasite called toxoplasmosis. And it's not that the cats are the problem, it's that the parasite is in their feces. And so if they are defecating in your garden or in areas where you are in contact with the soil, you run the risk of, and then you're not washing your hands properly. If you eat any of that, you could get toxoplasmosis. And most people that get it don't have any symptoms or very few symptoms. So it's estimated that more than 30 million people in the US carry the parasite, but it can be really dangerous, especially for pregnant women. So if you can exclude cats in particular, but dogs as well from your garden, that's recommended. And then, we often put up fencing already to exclude larger wildlife because they damage our fruits and vegetables, but they can also carry pathogens like E. coli and salmonella. I don't know how many folks here have backyard poultry, or whether it's geese or chickens or ducks in their garden. So there's some things to keep in mind if you do have these animals. One is if they're going to be kind of out and about in the garden, they will be fertilizing for you and can carry salmonella. And so that's a risk. And so think about timing, when are they going to be fertilizing your garden? You probably don't want them in with your strawberries and your lettuce, but if you have them in the fall and then move them to another area and grow your vegetables, you can think of it the same way as you would think if you were using raw manure for fertilizing your garden. You also want to be careful about cross-contamination. So if you are feeding these animals, think about having a separate pair of boots or shoes that you use for doing chores. Gloves, any tools can also be a source of cross-contamination. To reduce habitat for rodents, you can trim vegetation around the garden edges, try to locate compost piles away from your garden, and just think about how you can reduce habitat for rodents in and around your garden. Okay, so we've done all this work to think about risk and try to prevent contamination during the growing process. And now we've gotten to the harvest point. And so we're going to talk about some steps to minimize contamination during harvest. So really the biggest thing you can do is wash your hands before you harvest. So especially if you're harvesting food for other people, we can be a potential source of contamination as well. And we're going to talk about proper hand washing in a couple slides. Another thing that often comes up is the harvest tools and containers. So you want to be harvesting into a container that is that you can clean and sanitize. Wicker baskets and wooden baskets are lovely, but they're not, you can't sanitize them, and so they can harbor pathogens, and you can have your nice clean produce that you've gone to a lot of work to minimize contamination during the growing, and then when you pick it and put it into a dirty container, you run the risk of contaminating it. So, you know, the two main takeaways are, you know, wash your hands, harvest into a clean container. So the difference between cleaning and sanitizing. So cleaning is the process of using soap and water and friction to remove debris and surface material from a food contact surface. And then sanitizing is using something like a bleach solution to kill pathogens on the surface. And a simple sanitizer can be made with unscented bleach, so 1 teaspoon of water to 4 cups of water, and you can spray that on your food contact surface and let it sit, and then rinse with clean potable water, and that should be effective at sanitizing your food contact surface if you've cleaned it ahead of time. So we talked a little bit about harvest tools. So, you know, snips, if you can have a separate set of snips or scissors just for harvesting that you keep clean and sanitized. You know, of course, avoid harvesting produce that's obviously contaminated. So bird droppings, if you see feces in the garden, you know, remove that. And if it's close to berries, leafy greens, other produce that you're getting ready to harvest, really consider if you want to take that risk. Gloves are another potential source for contamination. So having a separate pair of gloves that you can wash for harvesting, or just using your bare hands and making sure you wash your hands well before harvest is important. And then absolutely only use potable water, so drinking water quality water when washing produce. And some tips about you know, washing produce. So there are benefits to washing produce, but not everything needs to be washed. Water is a really great vector. So if you have pathogens on the surface, especially if you're gonna wash stuff in a sink full of water and mix produce together, if there's a microorganism on the surface, it can be dislodged and spread around to all the other produce in the sink. So single pass water is safer. So like in this image where they're running water over the produce versus batch water where you would fill up a sink and mix all the produce together. You know, washing does provide other benefits that can lead to longer storage options, but it also, by introducing moisture into the environment, you can also run risks of both, you know, increasing pathogenic microorganisms as well as microorganisms that just lead to produce decay. And then a note about produce washes. So you may see products on the market for sanitizing produce, and these aren't recommended. So they haven't been found to be any more effective than just washing with plain water. And the FDA has not evaluated or tested them in a standardized way, or evaluated the safety of residues that they might leave on the surface. So, you know, save your money. You don't need to buy any special produce washes. Just wash with clean water. If you do wash, a couple things to keep in mind. So you want to remove the surface moisture after washing. So this reduces the ability of bacteria to grow. It also increases shelf life for your product. So, you know, let stuff air dry. If you are washing leafy greens, you know, salad spinners are great. You know, this is kind of a extreme example of this burlap, but you probably wouldn't want to put produce that you're going to be eating raw, like cucumbers and stuff, on a dirty surface. So, and then last but not least, we'll talk about gardener health and hygiene. As I mentioned before, you know, washing your hands, especially if you're harvesting food for other people, is one of the best things that you can do to reduce risk, because either the, you know, things that your hands have come into contact with, whether it's your cell phone or, garden soil or, yeah. We are all taught to wash our hands after using the bathroom, but there are a lot of other places where your hands can be contaminated. So if you have a school garden or a community garden, setting up a hand washing station is really important. And remember that hand sanitizers are not a replacement for hand washing. So thinking back to when we talked about harvest containers, the same is true with your hands when it comes to cleaning and sanitizing. So you can't sanitize a dirty surface. And so if your hands are dirty from working in the garden, just putting hand sanitizer on is not going to be effective in terms of removing or killing off microorganisms that are on the surface. So you need to make sure you wash your hands properly. Again, just be aware of any potential sources of cross-contamination, whether it's clothing, shoes, tools that you are using for harvest or in the garden close to harvest. What else have you used those things for? And if you have kids in the garden, just be aware of their activities. I have a 4-year-old, she's not sanitary. So, if they're picking stuff for their own, to eat on their own, there's probably minimal risk, but if they're touching other people's produce, really be observant of how they wash their hands and encourage them to sing happy birthday while they wash their hands. So proper hand washing technique, this may seem kind of basic, but you'd be surprised how many people don't actually wash their hands properly. Clean running water, warm is recommended, but it's not required. It just makes it easier to actually wash your hands for the full 15 seconds. Cold, if you have cold water, you tend to rush through the process. So you want to apply soap to build a good lather. It does not need to be antibacterial soap, just plain soap. Make sure that you get under your fingernails, if you have any jewelry, the backs of your hands are important places to scrub. You want to scrub vigorously for 10 to 15 seconds. So think singing happy birthday. And then rinse thoroughly to remove any traces of soap, and dry your hands using a single-use towel, not on your pants. I know people like to use dish towels, reusable towels, but just be aware of the potential risk for cross-contamination. The person who washed and dried their hands before you may not have done as good a job as you did, and so there may be pathogens on that surface. So, paper towels are common, but I've also seen folks use cheap washcloths that can be used once and then washed in a washing machine to sanitize. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about chemical contaminants, especially for folks that are gardening in an urban area or around older houses. Lead can be an issue. Cadmium and arsenic can also be an issue, especially in areas with older orchards. If you live near a busy road, you may have higher levels of lead in your soil because of lead in gasoline, which has now been, eliminated, but it's, historic. It is in the soil from historical use. So the exposure from lead comes from eating unwashed fruits and vegetables that have contaminated soil on them. So making sure that you wash the fruits and vegetables well. Don't, put dirty hands in your mouth. This is especially true for young children that are more at risk because they like to play in the dirt and don't wash their hands well and get dirt in their mouths that could be contaminated. And in the resources, we have some good publications that give you more specific information about gardening, especially with lead. So if you think you might be at risk, have your soil tested, make sure that you're getting it tested for heavy metals and lead. If you do have higher levels in your soil, cover the soil so that the dust doesn't blow around and you're not getting it on your shoes. Make sure you wash your hands well, and wash your leafy, produce. If you're growing leafy greens and root vegetables, crops that come into contact with the soil, grow them in a raised bed using soil that's not contaminated. So the take-home message is really, a lot of this I think is common sense, and just remember that you can't eliminate all risks, but think about where you might have risks in your garden, identify some things that you can do to minimize those risks, whether it's changing the timing of your fertilizer application, getting your water tested, teaching the kids in your school garden how to wash their hands properly and having a place for them to do it right there in the garden so it's easy for them to do. There are a lot of different ways that you can minimize risk in the garden, and communicate these practices. So once you've identified what you think are the main risks in your garden and how you want to address them, make sure you communicate that with everybody else who's working in the garden, because it's really everybody's responsibility to minimize these risks, to reduce the chance of anybody who eats food out of that garden from getting sick. So Brooke, I have a poll next, but I think maybe we should do some Q&A, because that's the end of the official presentation, and then I have a couple slides with resources for folks, but does it seem like Brooke, is now a good time for Q&A?
I think so. Usually how it works is that there's a pretty long list of questions here, and so you might have some folks that might trickle off, and so if you would like to go through your resources, and then folks that want to stay around to have the questions answered can do that. Okay.
Sounds good. So we will, the next slide is a poll. So I think Mark is going to launch this poll, and then we'll talk about resources.
And I'm launching that. Give me about 2 seconds. All righty. There we go. Okay. So folks, you can see the poll. Go ahead and list your responses there. We'll take 10 or 15 seconds for that. And just another 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Righty, and if you're curious, so kind of in the middle.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Good. Great. Okay. So Brooke posted these on the landing page. Is that correct, Brooke? Yeah, for this webinar. And in the recorded version, these will also be available. So some of these are Oregon specific, like this manual from the Oregon Department of Education. So we have a really robust school garden movement in Oregon, and the ODA put together this training and documentation manual. So if you are working in a school garden in Oregon, this is a really good resource, and it has some checklists and trainings that you can do with garden coordinators. Iowa State University has put together a curriculum for elementary school students and food safety in the garden, and working with those audiences. So they have a series of videos, and they have some interactive activities, quizzes, and things to get kids thinking about food safety in the garden. This publication from OSU Extension about reducing lead hazards in garden and play areas is a really good resource for anyone across the country, and it's available through our catalog. If you want to get really more in-depth information about food safety practices and more details about the different areas that I talked about today, Cornell University hosts the National Good Agricultural Practices Program. So this has been developed for commercial farmers, but a lot of this information is also useful for home gardeners and community gardeners, and they have resources and the research that backs up some of the things that we talked about today. The University of California Food Safety Program has a website with a lot of great resources about food safety for backyard gardeners. And then if you want to learn more about foodborne illness, the CDC has a lot of information on their website. So both about specifics about different types of pathogens and the illnesses, as well as sources and the studies that they do tracking foodborne illness outbreaks in the country. And then this last resource is an article through OSU Extension, again, about heavy metals in garden soils. So, okay, so let's go to Q&A.
Yeah, so you want me to, maybe I'll read out some of the questions so that that portion can get recorded. And then if it's something that you can answer, feel free to answer, but some of these might be more technical, and we can do some research and get some answers posted on our Learn page. So feel free to pass. I know it's hard to answer some questions on the spot. So Ken has a question about cyanotoxins. So in Oregon, we had one of our major cities, Salem, has their drinking waters contaminated with cyanotoxins, which is from a algae bloom up in our reservoir. And so the question is about, I think is about sort of gardening with this water. So we know that the cyanotoxin's present, and if you're preserving food and canning, it's still going to be present in that product. I don't know, this might be out of your expertise, but do you have any thoughts on using this water for gardening purposes?
So I don't know the specifics about cyanotoxins, but I would say, you know, it's surface water. So think about, you know, how you want to minimize risk from using any surface water, especially if you know that it's a contaminated source of water. So I wouldn't apply it so that it comes into contact with the edible portion of the crop. So especially with like berries and leafy greens. So if you can do drip irrigation, I don't know enough about the die off of the cyanotoxins to really be able to give specific advice, but it's a good question, and it seems like it's definitely an issue in parts of Oregon. So we can look into that and try to get more specifics.
Sounds good. And if we find out anything, Ken will post it on the Learn page. Cheryl has a question going back to your slide about manures, and you had given some advice about if you are going to use manure, incorporating them. And she wants to know, were you referring to use of raw manures or even the composted manures?
So the incorporation is important for raw manure, manure that's been composted properly, so that you know that it all the pathogens have been killed. There's actually a 0-day interval for applying compost, so you could apply it on the surface. If it doesn't have pathogens in it, then it doesn't pose a food safety risk. So with the soil incorporation, it's really raw manure, but you know, make sure you know the source of any composted manure that you're using and make sure that it's been treated properly. Otherwise, consider it raw manure. So, yeah.
Right. Pammy's got a question. She's working with a client that has a question about a septic field, the drain field. And is there research on a safe distance for planting edible crops from a drain field? Or I know you had mentioned leaks, so maybe that was a malfunctioning drain field.
Right. I don't know any research about distances for drain fields. I know just for, you know, drain field maintenance, you don't want to plant stuff on top of your drain field just because it could interfere with the drain field. The recommendations for manure and risks associated with manure is that it really depends. It depends on the type of manure, the environment. So, is it wet and likely to splash up on food, surfaces? Is it likely to spread if there's a rain event? Is it going to spread into your garden? So it really depends on the particular situation. I don't know if there's a set recommendation for distance. Yeah.
Thanks. I wasn't aware of one either.
Yeah.
Someone would like to know about worms and vermicomposting and using that as a fertilizer. Is there any research that you're aware of on that's related specifically to worm composting and any human risks?
I think that worm poop is generally considered safe. I don't know if there's been specific research on worm compost. So a lot of the research that's being done related to microorganisms and food safety is on a larger, like for a farm scale. And particularly with the fertilizers of animal origin, there's a big gap in research. So there's a lot of folks working on it right now, but I can look into it and see if there are any papers out there about it. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Quite a few questions coming in on rain barrels. And I do see if you're posting questions in the chat, could you just put them in the Q&A, because then we'll sort of keep track. That chat stream tends to go off. But there's quite a few questions about rain barrels. And I think this basically comes down to your catching water and maybe holding it for an extended period of time, sort of the stagnant water.
Right.
Are there recommendations? Is there any studies, any safety concerns about using those?
Yeah, so you should consider rainwater as surface water, because it's catching water from a roof, from a surface, and so any contaminants that might be on the roof could be washed into that rain barrel. So when you're using rainwater, think of it as surface water, and how you would minimize risk using surface water, unless you want to treat your rainwater before you apply it. So, I mean, there's some recommendations for using rain barrels to kind of reduce particularly algae growth, like having a opaque barrel, a black barrel or something, so that light doesn't get to the water, can reduce, algae growth. But yeah, it is a stagnant water source and could have pathogens in it. Even if you have a diversion system where the first flush gets diverted somewhere else, and then you collect the rainwater, think of it as surface water. Yeah.
There's a couple questions about reclaimed water, and you had also mentioned the term gray water in your presentation. Could you just explain the difference between those? Like, I know sometimes cities might have reclaimed water, and if there's any risks associated with that.
So if the city's treating the water before they send it to you, it depends on the treatment. So you should be able to ask the city how they're treating the water, and if they're treating it to reduce pathogens. I don't know if they're sending it just out for irrigation purposes, or if it's, if they're sending you reclaimed water to use in your household, it should be drinking water quality. Gray water, so some folks will collect like the water from their sink or their shower to use for irrigation purposes, which is different than black water, which is like water, if people have composting toilets, that they're collecting the liquid from your composting toilet. And so, there's a potential risk of pathogens in that water, just because you're washing your body and washing dishes and stuff in your sink. So it has a higher risk of carrying pathogens. And so it's recommended not to use it on edible gardens.
Great. So there's quite a few questions, and I'll kind of lump a few of these together about wildlife. So I see a question about squirrels in compost, different kinds of birds in the garden. Rhonda's having a rabbit outbreak, other concerns about these specific ones. Maybe one we might answer separately. Bob wants to know about slugs and snails. I think that there's maybe a parasite. I'm just scrolling through to see if there's any other rabbits, wild bird droppings.
Okay. So wildlife, birds and rodents often carry salmonella, campylobacter. There's so they do pose a risk. Squirrels, I don't know if anybody's actually trapped squirrels and tested what their pathogen loads are. There is a study that's looked at a lot of different wild animals. I can just look real quick and see if they even looked at squirrels. It's not in this paper, but I would say, there's a potential risk from all wildlife in the garden. Deer can carry E. coli, especially if they can commingle with domestic animals like cattle. You're never going to be able to totally eliminate wildlife from the garden. So, some of the things that you can do to minimize risk are make sure you're not, harvesting stuff that's obviously contaminated. Look for feces in your garden and try to remove it so that it doesn't get spread around by foot traffic, and try to minimize that habitat around the garden area to discourage wildlife from coming into your garden. And slugs and snails, I don't know anything about slugs and snails in the garden and parasites. I haven't, that's a question I haven't run across before. So
we do have a slug and snail webinar, so we can go back and look through that and see if Rory McDonald mentioned anything. And I think he touched on it, but I don't know if he expanded on that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty uncommon. I think that there have been some outbreaks in Hawaii with snails possibly in a parasite, but I think it's not very common. So,
there's a couple, so I'm going to jump around a little bit because there's a couple that I can group. You had mentioned a bleach solution for sanitizing, and I think people just want to catch that.
The ratio again.
Yes.
Yeah, so 1 teaspoon per 4 cups of water. But you want to make sure that you're using bleach that's okay for food contact surfaces, and not using kind of your typical laundry bleach, which often contains perfumes and things that you don't want to eat. So just straight bleach is recommended. Yeah, check the label.
And is there anything recommended that's not a bleach? Are there any other compounds that might be available?
I'm trying to think that would be available for like a home use. There's Sanidate, which is a peroxyacetic acid. There are some other products that aren't bleach, but they're typically not available in small quantities. So they may be harder to come by. Yeah.
You had mentioned when you were talking about harvesting and that not all produce needs to be washed. And so do you have some examples of things that don't necessarily are a lower risk and don't necessarily need a washing treatment before?
Yeah, so I mean, if there's stuff that's up off the ground in particular. If there are raspberries, not strawberries, tomatoes, peppers, if you have cucumbers on a trellis, things that aren't coming into contact with the ground, and if they're not visibly contaminated, it's likely, there's no way to guarantee that they're 100% safe, but they're likely to have less risk than, a tomato that's has dirt on it. It's not that dirt is the contaminant, it's that there might be pathogens in the dirt based on other gardening practices, the type of fertilizer you're using, or if you have animals in the garden, those sorts of things.
Two other topics that there's a couple of questions on. So one is pesticides and one is on lead. So I don't know which one you want to go for first. So Lynn wants to know about pesticide drift and some, concerns if it went onto her edible crops. Is it still safe to eat? And then let me scroll down here a little bit. So the pesticide drift issue onto edible gardens.
Edible stuff. I don't know specifically about 2,4-D. You would want to check the label of the product and see if there's recommendations on that. I don't know. Brooke, do you have any?
When I get questions from the public about that, I usually will refer them to the National Pesticide Information Center. Mm-hmm. They have a call center that they run in the morning hours. It's national, and you can actually call with specific pesticide questions there, and they might be able to walk you through, like if you know exactly what was sprayed, they can talk you through that. So I'll make sure to put that link to that on the resources so that you can call with the specific questions.
Great, thanks.
A couple questions about lead. So Anthony wants to know, do all vegetables and fruit take up lead from the soil? And
so they don't actually take up lead from the soil. It's just that the soil on the surface, if there's lead in the soil, it's the lead on the surface, and so the risk is from ingesting the soil or particles of lead that might be on the surface from contaminated soil. The plants don't actually take up lead.
Debbie has a question about using windfall apples for cider juice. So apples that have maybe fallen off of the tree and they're getting harvested, picked up off the ground. Yeah,
I would not recommend it. Even if you were to wash them in bleach, in a bleach solution, you wouldn't necessarily remove all the pathogens. If you're gonna pasteurize the juice, possibly, because it has a kill step.
Actually, that was going to be, I was thinking about that from like a brewing for cider or those kinds of things.
Right.
Do you generally feel like the fermentation is going to sort of have a cleansing effect? That's fair, right?
So you want to think about, you need a kill step. So what's going to kill the microorganism? So with cider and juice and stuff, heat treatment to pasteurize it, the fermentation process, usually if you have a robust community of the fermentation bacteria, they do a good job of outcompeting the other bacteria and creating an environment that is inhospitable to other to the pathogenic bacteria. So by changing the pH in particular, like with sauerkraut.
Okay.
So do you have time, Sarah, to take just maybe a few more, and then we might have to answer some of these offline because we're running over our time.
Yeah. So I see some questions about harvesting. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe this question about, where you said don't put your harvest containers on the ground.
Yeah.
In Oregon, you pick, that's what we're about. And so you're out in a farmer's field putting your containers on the ground, do you have any tips to
Yeah.
avoid that?
So it really depends on the harvest container. And remember, what we're trying to do here is prevent contamination of the product. So if your harvest container has holes in the bottom of it and the ground might come into contact with the produce, or if you're going to stack harvest containers on top of each other where there's soil on the bottom of the top container that could fall or contact produce in the lower container, those are situations where there might be a risk of contaminating produce. If you have a clean bucket that is has a closed bottom and you're putting on the ground, there shouldn't really be a risk from that. So yeah.
Great. So Mark can send us this question list. And so what we can do is sort of summarize this, the ones that we weren't able to answer live, and we can get these answers posted back on that Learn landing page.
Okay.
And Sarah, if you're willing to share a PDF, we've had a couple of requests of just to go back and be able to look at the details in your presentation. And
Sure.
so if that's okay, well, I think we're going to end it here.
Okay.
And I really appreciate you taking the time, Sarah. I know we can't all clap for you because you can't see everybody, but just from the comments, I think people really enjoyed that. And for all you Master Gardeners in Oregon, our next advanced training webinar is July 26th, and we're going to have Robin Rosetta joining us to talk about emerging insect pests in Oregon, so things to look out for. All right. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.